Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. I'm talking today with Nick Danforth, a senior visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Nick, it's good to have you on the show.
Good to be on here.
Yeah, I wanted to have you on because obviously for those who are watching the news and are interested in this podcast, I think it's quite obvious that with the Turkish intervention in Syria that began 8 days ago from the day that we were recording this, relations with the U.S. Are in a downward spiral, and I think there's a general incoherence, perhaps on the U.S. side, and maybe bewilderment or similar incoherence on the Turkish side. You know, you just got back from about, I think, 8 months yourself in Turkey, perhaps longer. I mean,
yes,
you were watching this sort of like in Istanbul, not in Ankara, but like maybe what you felt as the invasion got closer to northeast Syria, and more or less like what it was like to live in Turkey during this time of problematic relations with the U.S.
I wish I had some colorful anecdotes or some, I could pretend to have the pulse of people on the ground. Sitting in Istanbul, things seemed very calm. There was an earthquake right before I came back. That felt much more alarming than anything going on in the Syrian border. The refugees were something people were eager to talk about. The anger at the United States was real, but then it has been for a long time. If anything, it almost feels like in Washington, the change in mood has been more dramatic. The anger that's also been around towards Turkey for a long time is, as you said, is really boiling over, is spilling over, is taking on a life of its own, somewhat incoherent life of its own.
Yeah, I mean, I want to talk one thing, because you mentioned it up top, and I think it's a good point to start, is, I think what's overlooked perhaps here in the U.S. And some work that both of our friends, Max Hoffman, is doing over at the Center for American Progress, is like the after effects or the effects of the Syrian war on Turkey are not just about the Kurdish issue, and I think we can talk about that in a second, but how everyday life in Turkey has been impacted by the Syrian refugee issue, and about how Turks are growing fed up with refugees, and perhaps that's one aspect of their desire to see them go home to Syria, and like driving why it is that they would support cross-border military action to try and create space for them.
Right, and I wouldn't say necessarily that Erdogan's plan to resettle 2 million Syrians in northeastern Syria was the driving reason behind the operation they were conducting. It also doesn't look like that's something they're going to be able to achieve. But certainly at a time when Erdogan was facing growing anger across the political spectrum for the presence of refugees in Turkey, when that cost his party in the last elections, it was certainly a way for Erdogan to sell this to the public. It was certainly a way for Erdogan to make it look like there was a plan, to make it look like there was a way of dealing with this refugee population, which again, people have been very angry at. And I also, Max was very good at pointing out, I think he said the equivalent of 16 million Mexican refugees coming to the United States, that would create an enormous amount of anger here.
Yeah, and so in that respect, Syrians who have come to Turkey, they're present on the streets in most big Turkish cities, obviously very present in towns and cities along the border. Is that sort of one facet of the way that, like, maybe the ordinary Turk, in very generic air quotes, thinks about this? But I think the other one is you touched about this, is the growing anger, or at least enduring anger at this point, at the United States for how it chose to conduct its operations in Syria. So for listeners, the U.S. intervened in Syria, really depending on how you date it, 2014, at the end of 2014 into early 2015, and they chose a specific militia and a very narrow mission to go after Islamic State. I mean, do you want to talk about like how Turks were talking about that to you, both in Ankara and Istanbul, over your time there, your recent time there?
What's strange about the situation in Turkey is, to me, it makes perfect sense that at a point where the United States is very openly partnering with an organization that's been at war with the Turkish state for decades, that this would cause enormous anger amongst the Turkish population, and of course it does. The strange thing that I think is hard, for me to understand, I imagine even harder for people who aren't following this to understand, is that people in Turkey have been convinced that the United States is actually supporting this group, has been supporting the PKK for decades now. From actually decades before we actually were supporting the PKK. So there's something surreal about the fact, this was a kind of conspiratorial, paranoid accusation that people in Turkey have been making back to the 90s, when in fact the United States is working very closely with Turkey to fight the PKK. So there's something surreal about seeing this paranoid fantasy actually come true.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out is like when the U.S. went to war in Syria, they chose to partner with essentially what is the Syrian branch of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which in Syria, depending on which acronym you choose on the day, is on the sort of civilian side, the PYD, or the Democratic Union Party, which is for all intents and purposes just the PKK in Syria with a different three-letter acronym. And I totally agree with you. I think one of the reasons that, we'll get into the American anger about this, but like it's the refusal on the U.S. side, wonder if you can talk about this, to sort of just accept the very basic fact that Turkey has a right to be angry.
Right.
And that's okay if like what it is that the United States had chose to do, which is intervene in Syria with a narrow mission to defeat Islamic State. And we accepted that Turkish anger as an outcome of something that was greater priority-wise for the U.S., which was the defeat of ISIS. I just don't think Turks see it like that.
Well, and I think some of our own incoherence about how we misunderstood Turkey and then how we were pursuing our interests in Syria exacerbated the very deep fears that Turkey had. There was always a tendency on the U.S. side to say this is about, we're going to try to work with Turkey to prevent cross-border attacks or to prevent the transfer of weapons from the YPG to the PKK, as if this was a tactical problem that we could work with Turkey to solve. And from Turkey's point of view, it was about something much larger. It was about their really deep fears about what our long-term intentions were in working with the YPG. So when we said we'd force the YPG to withdraw from the territory of Manbij, and then we didn't go through with that, it was a little confusing, I think, for Americans because Manbij didn't seem all that important in the scheme of things. But I think for Turkey, that became evidence of our intentions or of a lack of honesty, and that generated greater suspicion. And then when ISIS was defeated and we, in a very informal or confused way, seemed to transfer into a new anti-Iran, anti-Assad mission that we were going to work with the YPG to carry out. That, again, is to your point, that wasn't why we said we were doing it. And when our reason changed, that also set off alarm bells in Ankara.
Yeah, and so it's been, when you talk to U.S. government officials, I'm going to steal a line from one of them because I think it's a really great line. It's that they call it Turkey fatigue, is that as this is going on, we've lurched from crisis to crisis because this isn't just about Syria. Syria will return to, it's like one basket, and it's ultimately the basket that may break, I guess it may break the U.S. Turkish relationship. Yeah. We're close. We'll finish with that. But there's other stuff that's going on, as outgrowths of this, Turkey's consolidation, the consolidation of authoritarianism in Turkey, and how that's manifested in the U.S. Turkish relationship.
Right.
Which is, Erdogan becomes the face of Turkey. He's the person the U.S. government has to deal with, but he's also the man behind the taking of U.S. hostages who have deep political connections and who is enmeshed in sanctions busting schemes. I think that's really hard for Turks to really grapple with because they don't want to be represented by Erdogan, at least most of the Turks that we interact with. Right.
No, and what's confusing when you talk to people in Turkey about this is there are kind of two visions of how people in Turkey present this. And one is a kind of strategic sense in which the world is changing. We're moving towards a more multipolar, less US-centric world. And so Turkey is trying to pursue a more independent, flexible foreign policy, and that involves counterbalancing the US with new relations with Russia. It involves standing up to the US to pursue its interests, as in the case in Syria. And if, you can disagree with aspects of that policy, you can disagree with whether it's going to be effective, but there's a obvious recognizable strategic logic to that. And then at the same time, you have this much deeper, angrier, more paranoid current about, Erdogan saying explicitly that the United States is the biggest threat to Turkey, accusing the United States of trying to undermine him through the 2016 coup. And then that fear, that hostility leading towards actions, like you said, taking U.S. Government employees hostage, arresting a U.S. pastor, things that create, really deep anger in Washington, which exacerbates the stakes and exacerbates the U.S. response to the real strategic differences over things like Syria or the S-400 missiles.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that's unique. How long were you in Turkey? I can't remember. I remember you leaving, and I remember you coming back, which is a couple days ago. I just can't remember
Yeah,
how much
let's
time
say
was in
8 months.
between.
I think was
That's
the
about 8 months. You live in Washington, or your apartment is in Washington, and so you got to sort of see like the juxtaposition of U.S. discussions reaction to Turkey 8 months ago, and then fast forward 8 months while you were literally out of the country.
right.
How would you say those have changed, from doing the DC circuit, speaking circuit 8 months ago, and then obviously just back a couple of days?
I mean, I don't know. I'll admit I've seen the anger grow in Washington before I went to Turkey. It seemed to me like it was going to boil over for a long time. That you were going to get things like the kind of sanctions that are being discussed now, that when Turkey went ahead and bought the S-400s, I did assume sanctions were going to come immediately.
I did too.
Yes, I don't. So far, I've been, and people in Turkey kept saying, look, we're too important to Washington. At the end of the day, they're not going to risk offending us. They're not going to risk going overboard with strategically counterproductive sanctions. I kept saying, you're giving us too much credit. We might. And it looks like we're on the verge of that. But again, I feel like I've been being wrong about this for the last 8 months. So,
Yeah, I think for listeners, it's important to sort of place this in its context. I also agree is that, there have been moves, particularly from Congress, to use the threat of sanction and then the imposition of sanction to try and change Turkish behavior. So the first aspect of this we saw was over this came from the executive, but it's similar to the Pastor Brunson issue, which was the use of global Magnitsky sanctions on a couple of Turkish ministers to try and force his release, which was ultimately successful, albeit I'm not sure because of the sanctions. Two was as Turkey and Russia, flirted and then ultimately consummated a deal for the S-400 missile system. There was this Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act, which is supposed to mandate secondary sanctions on those. It's supposed to use secondary sanctions, on those that do significant transactions with Russian defense companies. Turkey having purchased the S-400, that would qualify as a significant transaction. But the Trump administration we're learning new stuff every day.
Can you explain what the...
Well, we don't quite know, but the Trump administration has been hesitant to use CATSA, right? And so CATSA has been looming out there and not actually following through on sanctions despite congressional pressure. And then now it seems like the dam may have broken with the invasion of Syria 8 days ago, forcing the U.S. to withdraw, albeit in ways Donald Trump wanted. And Congress agitating for more. I mean, what do you make of all this sort of sanctions agitation? And let's assume you can go back and forth. I mean, where do you think this is going?
And it's hard to tell because, as you said, Congress had mandated the CATSA sanctions, and then the administration, not just didn't, they could have waived them. They would have had to make up an excuse, but instead of even waiving them, they just didn't do anything. And so now you have another bill in Congress that actually mandates the administration to do what it was already mandated to do. This could be Turkey's chance to provoke its own unique, special U.S. constitutional crisis, depending on how
they excel at that.
But no, I think part of the risk for Turkey now is that they've fallen afoul of, or they've gotten sucked into U.S. domestic politics in a way where, they were really counting on Trump to make all their problems go away. And the way the U.S. system is set up, that's very hard for him to do. And the more accommodating Trump seems to be of Erdogan, the more that generates deep and widespread bipartisan hostility towards Trump, but then redirected towards Turkey. And as you said, once the dam breaks, there are so many possible ways that Congress could express its anger that I think would be deeply counterproductive and would further the spiral of declining relations.
Yeah, we don't know. I think one of the problems is, and I think a colleague said this, and I'm paraphrasing, but the legislature in the U.S. can't conduct a foreign policy without an acquiescent executive, and Trump doesn't seem willing to go all the way when it comes to sanctioning Turkey. The question I have for you, maybe as we sort of pivot to the end here, is this this overt American incoherence actually a good thing? Because if all of these sanctions are actually passed, Where does that leave U.S. Turkish relations? I mean, obviously matters because Turkey's a NATO ally. It's just not something that can be easily tossed aside, and I think that's part of the problem.
Right. In a more coherent administration, you could imagine a kind of good cop, bad cop thing where Congress was very aggressive. Congress was pushing for sanctions in a way that reflected U.S. interest. The executive could kind of go back and forth with Turkey and work on a way to channel that pressure towards something productive. But it doesn't. I mean, the incoherence makes that very hard, and it makes it easy for Turkey to think that at the end of the day, they can make all of this go away. And it makes, well, if Congress can't conduct a good foreign policy, it can use the tools at its disposal to try to shape foreign policy in much blunter ways. And if, as you have Trump not going through on some of the more targeted or potentially effective things, you're just going to have angry, emotional, satisfying sanctions coming out of Congress that will do the damage without the possibility for results.
Yeah, and I think we're close to approaching that point. So it's always been my contention that Trump and Turkey bet on Trump, and I think they bet on Trump for a whole bunch of ways that are now coming to light as part of other, let's say, corruption and impeachment related proceedings going on as it pertains to Ukraine. But that's beyond the scope of this podcast. But Trump, through his refusal to execute on CAATSA, has actually bucked the wishes of those that are most important to him, which are Senate Republicans. And in doing that, he is burning political will as he tries to cobble together with Lindsey Graham a compromise about the S-400 issue, about CAATSA. But if these people start to really agitate for more aggressive work because of the collapse of the U.S. position in Syria because of Turkey, which is exactly what happened, because the Turkish invasion forced a U.S. withdrawal. Now, whether Trump greenlit it or not, I think Congress is willing to ignore, unless you're a Democrat. You then end up in this place where I think where you said is you just have blunt tools trying to force the administration and nobody wanting to take the foot off the accelerator because Trump has burned his bridges even with his own party.
Right.
And so while they may not criticize him overtly, they're going to criticize him legislatively. That's where I feel we're at. And I think one of the big issues, and maybe we'll wrap here and I want your thoughts on this, is people, I mean, it came up in the Democratic debate last night, if anybody was watching, is just, does anybody think Turkey's an ally in the U.S. anymore? And maybe vice versa. What do Turks think about the U.S. as an ally?
Right.
Sort of, that was one of those conference questions where I say, and what do you think?
No and no. I mean, again, Erdogan's on record saying the United States is the biggest threat facing Turkey today. And we're not quite at that point in Washington, but what did Stephen Cook say? You used to not be able to swing a dead cat without hitting someone who said Turkey was a great ally. Now you could swing a dead cat for days without hitting anyone who did think Turkey was a good ally.
I love Stephen, but yeah, that's a good quote.
No, I mean, it's not that we romanticize the U.S.-Turkish relationship. It wasn't driven by sincere love on both sides for decades now. It's always been tension. There's always been a lot of issues, but at the point where you literally have no one left in Washington with something good to say about Turkey who's not Donald Trump or being paid to say something good about Turkey, it makes a relationship hard to sustain.
And what do you think about the Turkish side? I mean, it's hard to find Turks who, even sympathetic ones, who aren't doing the same thing in Ankara or Istanbul. It's just, Washington has made such catastrophic mistakes in Syria. What are they good for?
And again, I think what makes it hard in Turkey is that you have a mix of some people for whom they really do think the worst of the United States. This is very emotional. This is very paranoid, combined with people who, for much more rational strategic reasons, are saying, Turkey has a lot of frustrations with Washington, and it's time for Turkey to take a more independent tack. And in the short run, at least, the political impact of those two approaches overlap, and is going to, even without all the emotional baggage, would still lead to a more strained relationship. And when you add in the deep hostility, the political points that Erdogan and the opposition can score by being anti-American, it's going to be hard to sustain from that side, even if people do recognize that there are strategic benefits to it.
Yeah, and the last point, just because both you and I were in Brussels last week for a conference.
It's a great town.
Yeah, no, I always enjoy Brussels. It's not the most picturesque place in Europe, but it's nice. Good beer. Question, and one of the things that struck me in my interactions there, and I'm wondering if you got it, is that, like in the case of Iran, right? Turkey could, in that case, go to a shared sense of like being wronged by the U.S. And here I'm talking about U.S. extraterritorial sanctions, and kind of find some cover there on this issue on Syria, but like broader like I guess broader Turkish European problems. Here I'm talking about drilling in Cypriot EEZs for gas, and that's a whole other podcast to go into, but not on this one. There's nobody in the Western camp, outside of a very, very few people who are making the case for Turkey. And so on this, just to bring it back full circle, on the Syria issue, the invasion has caused so many problems for both U.S. and European security interests. Put Donald Trump aside for a second.
Right.
They are kind of in the wilderness looking around. That becomes even more sort of like problematic for me if I was a strategic Turkish thinker.
Well, and in Europe, I mean, you have exactly the same alienation of popular opinion. I mean, you have the pro-Kurdish left on one side, which is alienated. You have the Islamophobic right on the other side, which is alienated. I guess the difference in Europe is no matter how angry they get at Turkey, I think it's the problems that Turkey can cause, and the deep connection with Turkey is a little closer to the surface. And the United States can put a lot of sanctions on Turkey in a very casual, maybe destructive way, and not worry about it. At a certain point, a lot of European economies that are deeply connected to Turkey's. There are even stronger limits to I think how tough Europe can get and how tough Europe would be willing to get on Turkey, even if they were, even as you said, if they were as fed up and hostile to what Turkey was doing as they are.
Where do you think this is going, man? I mean, it makes me uncomfortable, but and I don't think we'll get there, but I mean, we have to at least, do you think, begin entertaining, like 5 years from now, what a sort of non-aligned Turkey looks like in a post-Trump era, assuming, where sort of the U.S. has kind of moved on, because its interests are truly global, and Syria is like the mosquito that buzzes in the ear. I know that the media hysteria this week wouldn't suggest that, but Syria really is a tiny problem for U.S. foreign policy. But for Turkey, it remains a magnified issue and sort of the driver of like populist politics or even strategic thinking. So as the U.S. moves on, it wants to go back and focus on Russia or focuses on China, and we forget all about the Syrian Kurds, and Donald Trump is a sort of footnote in history. Where do you think the U.S. and Turkey will be at that point?
Right, and I guess I could see two ways that would play out. One, we move on in a healthy way and get over a lot of the very concrete bilateral tensions that we're facing right now, and get to a point where relations aren't close. We're not cooperating militarily effectively, but at the end of the day, we recognize Turkey's importance in dealing with Russia and dealing with Iran, and we work out some kind of modus vivendi. Or we move on in a much more hostile way, and we write Turkey off, and we decide that we're going to work more closely with Greece. We're going to align with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We now see Israel, Cyprus, and Greece working together, not explicitly saying that's to contain Turkey, but implicitly saying that's to contain Turkey. And you have, and then Turkey has to take much more aggressive steps to try to get its interests recognized vis-a-vis the United States and Europe. And you have both sides settle into a much more hostile relationship. And that's, I think we're not going to save the U.S. Turkish alliance. My recommendation, and I don't have great advice about how to do that, would simply be that we avoid letting this spiral of hostility get out of control.
If you catch my sigh on our fancy microphone here at FPRI, that's because that requires Congress to sort of take a broader view and slow down a little bit here. And I just don't have that much faith in the world's greatest deliberative body. But if anything, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a roller coaster, and as I always say, rock and roll.
Yeah.
It's good for us. Well, bad for us, but good for us in that we're never bored. We won't be talking about the customs union.
I look forward to being on here in 5 years discussing what the hell went wrong.
Yeah, or maybe things will be better. We'll be talking about how to harmonize Turkish and American agricultural laws for a free trade agreement. Who knows? So with that, Nick, it's good to have you back in the U.S.
Good to be back.
And thanks for coming on the show, and thanks everybody for listening.